QSO Today, episode 476, David Okrent, W7DAO. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com web page. The following amateurs have become listener sponsors this week: Stuart Watchman, ZL2TW, George Hulla, N8DTN, Brian Whitcomb, K7KX, and Stephen Schwarm, W3EVE, made a $25 donation. There were other anonymous donors who did not wish to be mentioned, but we thank them for their support of the QSO Today project. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, "Ham radio, do people still do that?" This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I so appreciate those of you who are volunteering to be guests and also support the QSO Today project with your sponsorships and donations. It helps to keep the lights on and pay for the infrastructures that keep us delivering the QSO Today podcast to you every week. David Okrent, W7DAO, like many hams, grew up with shortwave radio, electronic kits, and a radio interest that led to a professional career related to our hobby. David focuses the use of these skills and expertise on emergency rescue and treatment, as a military medical corpsman, as an EMT, and providing volunteer support to the Red Cross. Contribution and giving back to his community drives W7DAO, who is my QSO today. W7DAO, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, David?
Yes, I am. Good to hear from you and see you, Eric 4Z1UG.
David, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I think in some respects it's a lot like others and how it started. I don't remember how I ended up with a penchant for playing with electricity when I was younger. My father was an engineer. He was a chemical engineer and a nuclear engineer. And so I had a real kind of penchant for science when I was younger, and still do. It's not like it went away, but it was very early on. I don't remember what caused it, but I got one of those. My father gave me a gift for my birthday, I think, one of those old 101 electronic project kits with the spring clips.
Sure, I remember.
And started playing with that. And when, of course, like any other young starting off ham in the 60s and 70s, pre-ham, I built a crystal radio set so I can hear AM stations. I was living in New Jersey, and of course I could hear WABC and all the other stations out there. And then as the evening came, I discovered about AMDX and started hearing longer distance stations with my little crystal radio and a long wire antenna. And so that kind of got me sparked in antennas, or in radios, I should say. And I was lucky in the sense that my junior high or middle school, as you would say today, wasn't kind of like, let's have one state curriculum. It was very individualized. So we had a lot of science in my junior high, and one of the sciences we had was electronics, radio electronics. So I had 2 semesters of radio electronics and learned electricity and electronics, built regenerative tube receivers and other things like that, and found that probably I have this thing where I like tuning radios and listening what's coming in. And then by the time I was in high school and taking high school electronics for 3 years, is when I started really discovering shortwave listening and was able to get hooked on that radio jukebox from Radio Netherlands, Radio Moscow, even Radio Cuba, BBC, etc. And I got hooked on that. I was aware in high school because of a student who was a ham radio operator. I was aware of ham radio, but one of the problems is Morse code. So I really wanted to go into that area in high school, but one of the problems or impasses was I don't know how to describe it. I have kind of a sound dyslexia. It's one of the reasons I don't spell very well. I get mixed up on sounds, and every time I try to learn the Morse code, by the time I get to a few letters together, everything swarms, and I can't figure it out. I mean, trying to learn CW again now, and I get like halfway through the alphabet, and then they start mixing letters, and I'm lost. I can't figure it out. And so it's a little bit, I'm going to keep going at it and see what happens. But so it became an impasse for me because I couldn't retain it. It's like I can't even retain music. I have to have someone sometimes standing by me to start a music so I can recover from memory, if I want to sing something in other respects. So it was a big impasse, so I had to sort of turn that off. And then about 2007, obviously family and career, and like any other ham, or proto ham, I didn't have a lot of time. But about 2007, look back into it for some reason. Oh, there's no code anymore. Well, there we go. I was trained after high school. This is the long form of the answer. I was trained in high school, and I went originally to electrical engineering for college and decided I didn't like how it was being done and it wasn't for me.
This interest in electronics and science that you had in high school caused you to choose an engineering major.
Yes.
And where did you decide to go for that engineering major?
I started at the University of Washington.
In Washington State?
Yeah, in Washington, Seattle, Washington.
So somehow you'd migrated to the West Coast.
In 1969, my family moved to Washington State. So I was about 12 years old.
And your father being a nuclear engineer, did that put him out isn't there a nuclear power plant in Washington State?
Yeah, the Hanford Reservation. Actually, he worked for a company. He ended up being the head of data processing for the company, and it was headquartered. Its business headquarters was in Bellevue, Washington, and it's the actual business of building fuel packets was in Richland, Washington. And so we came to Bellevue, Washington, and then my father and mother, many, many years later, moved to Richland, Washington when they consolidated the company into Richland.
You went to the University of Washington in order to learn electronic engineering, and then what happened?
Well, a couple of things along the way. One is I went specifically, my interest was in biomedical engineering. I had this really concept in high school. I had this sort of really drawn to, and this is 1976 when I graduated high school, computerization of prosthetics was interesting to me. And also I had this idea that there was going to be a convergence between biological systems and computer systems, maybe around DNA, and I wanted to be at the convergence. And so that was my draw. And the closest place I could go was UW. They did not have a biomedical program. So, but, electrical engineering with throwing in some more biology for myself would be accepted as an interdisciplinary degree. But essentially, I wasn't really ready to, not ready to go. I just wasn't interested in what they were teaching. I tended to skip my electronics classes to go into biology classes. I tended to do my brother's business homework when instead of doing my electronics. And mostly because it was, the way they did it back then was it was all math. And I had been coming out of 6 years of electronics with hands-on like a technician, building stuff.
Yes, I know this story.
Yeah, and they don't want you to build anything. And so, and in fact, my brother, I have a twin brother, he was at the other side of the state in WSU, and I went to visit him, and I went to their engineering library, and I found all the current books. At the time, the UW was really focused on power engineering, and so all the books were like 1950s. So it's like I was in the wrong school. But I really just got disenchanted with, I don't really know what I want to do. Is this what I want to do? And I went over to the community college. I knew I had lots of electronics. I said, okay, I'll be an electronics technician. I looked at what's the highest paid electronics technician. There were two. One was industrial and one was biomedical. And I said, well, in parallel to all this, I've been working in emergency rooms. So I said, okay, I'll go biomedical. And so I ended up as biomedical electronics. And then years later, industrial electronics. So I carried both of them.
And why were you working in emergency rooms? Because you had an interest in emergency medicine?
Yeah. I had an interest I just sort of, again, things I dropped into. I was asked to help with something for an organization. And the next thing I knew, I was an EMT. And I was working in emergency rooms. And I was always working and going to school. So I was working in emergency rooms. Going to school, I worked on ambulances around the Seattle area and also took some time off and went and worked ambulance in East Oakland, California, and worked in neonate intensive care ambulance transport. I taught EMTs for many, many years in New York State when I moved out there, and then Washington State. So, and I was in Navy, United States Navy, as a medical corpsman in the reserves. So I actually had this kind of parallel thing going on always. Gave my last shot in 1998. And that was the last time I ever did anything medical. But it was always, when I was in the emergency room, part of me was always saying, well, I wonder if a machine could do that. I wonder if a computer could do that. And so there was where that tie-in to biomedical electronics came into. And I remember when I was being hired by a company that made heart monitors and defibrillators as a technician, they said, are you familiar with our equipment? And I said, sure. And I've used every one of your pieces of equipment. They said, oh, okay. And it turned out that came in handy because I could spot things that users were having problems with. I could spot them and understand them. And when I left that company, they hired somebody with exactly the same background that I have. So that was kind of fun. And then I went into scientific instrumentation in environmental monitoring of particulates and things. And that's where I kind of transitioned out of electronics and into product management and back and more into the business side of things.
You mentioned before we started that you're now in marketing. There's a bridge, isn't there? There's the product manager, and then there's the marketing product manager.
Right.
There's somebody on the engineering side who talks to somebody in the marketing department in a very large company to make sure that whatever feedback is coming from marketing is being maybe implemented in the timeline or the product development schedule for the product, right?
Yeah, and I held, it was a small company, and it's like getting your MBA, the small company, so it was great, And I was the kind of product manager where you did the whole soup to nuts. So you were the marketing manager, you were the production, you were the engineering and the production person, you were a designer. So you got to basically do any aspect of the business was open to you. And then I kind of transitioned when I came to the company I'm in now to pure marketing, brand management, promotions, research and analysis, strategy development. So I'm out of the product management role, although I do sometimes consult inside as an ex-product manager, but mostly as a pure marketer now.
And you like that in terms of, your fingers aren't in it anymore, I guess, in the equipment anymore, or are they? Do you have an opportunity to actually go put your fingers in the toys you're marketing?
No, well, in the early days, I was actually brought in to be kind of the business person technologist as part of a senior R&D group that was developing new software products for the industry I'm in. And so I had the background to be able to build these, conceptualize and start building some of the software products. But what I also brought to the table is I knew how to bring them to commercialization. And so that's what I brought in. And then kind of at that point, it was all software. I wasn't touching any hardware anymore. And so in other respects, turning back to amateur radio was myself turning back to my roots of being able to touch electronics and start building things again.
Do you work from home or do you actually commute?
Since COVID, I work from home pretty much every day. I probably started coming back into the office a few months ago, one day a week. But I am my group doesn't require me to come back into the office every day. Other groups around me are now coming back in the office every day. But I'm not, because my team really doesn't exist in one location. It's worldwide, so it wouldn't really matter, I actually do prefer to work in the office, but it doesn't really, there's nobody to talk to.
So in 2007, you discovered that amateur radio still exists, that it has no code requirement. What did you do in order to make that next step into amateur radio?
I grabbed the ARL licensing books because I have a background in electronics. I just needed really the rules of the road. And so I went through the books, went through the first two books in about a week. Then about a few weeks later, took a test at the Radio Club of Tacoma and passed the tech in general. And then a few months later, I went back and took the extra.
And how did you discover the Radio Club of Tacoma? Did you just kind of go Googling for it and to see whether you could find out what's nearby?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, the in this area, the person who has a great resource for us for what's happening around the classes and testing and things like that is Lynn Burlingame, and he's N7CFO, and it's n7cfo.com, and pretty much lists a lot of the things in this area. He's the one you mentioned beforehand, but I'll bring it up. He's the one who runs the Northwest Speakers Bureau. And so on that is where you can download the Speakers Bureau and see who's available and get them to talk to at your clubs.
Now, is he the ARRL section chief or something like that? Is he affiliated with the ARRL?
He is. I don't remember what position he's holding right now.
Division director.
Yeah, he used to hold a position. I don't know if he still holds a position, but he used to hold one of the local positions. But he's kind of like a fixture in this area. People know who he is. He's one of those guys who everyone knows him. He's a great resource, and he's been a ham probably at least 50, 60 years.
How many clubs are there in the Seattle area? Have you had a chance to kind of figure that out?
No. I would say, I've never really bothered to look. I would say that there's at least in the Seattle area, I would say there's at least 6. The biggest one is the one I belong to, Mike and Key, which has got about over 300 members now, I believe. mikeandkey.org, O-R-G. And then there's the West Seattle Amateur Radio Club. And then there's the Boeing has 2 amateur radio clubs, one in the north and one in the Seattle area. Those are the ones off the top of my head that I know of personally. In this immediate area, there are other ones, of course, I know of up in Whatcom County and places like that down in Portland.
I also understand that Seattle also has a very extensive Arden network. Is that something that you're involved with?
I've looked at it a couple of times. I haven't gotten into it. I keep thinking about it. I have to check and see where I am. As you know, Seattle is a rather hilly area. And the tie-in locations, I am down in the Rainier Valley. So to get Linus, I technically, I think I can get to the Arden network. And I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet. I haven't been there yet, but I'm aware of it. I keep looking at the webpage, start thinking about it, and then I don't go forward.
So you're south of Seattle, Tacoma area then? As I recall, Mount Rainier is southeast of downtown Seattle?
I'm using local lingo instead of geographical lingo. I'm in Seattle. So if I'm in Seattle, I am what we call the Rainier Valley in Seattle is Rainier Avenue. And so I am about, if you know where the old baseball stadium is, Sick Stadium, if you all know where that is, I'm 5 miles south of that. And I'm just about 5 miles north of Renton. So I'm I'm on the 5 miles north of Renton on off of Rainier Avenue. If
you're traveling to Seattle and you've never been there before, I recommend a ferry ride whenever you can.
And especially on a clear day. On a clear day, it's beautiful.
You're on the water and it's cold and it smells like the sea. Yeah, I like it. Okay, so you got your license in 2008?
I think so, yeah.
You quickly upgraded to extra class?
Yep.
What did you find was the operating mode that you liked the most at this point?
That would be SSB.
So you like working single sideband? Do you have a band that's a favorite?
I tend to work 20 the most, and then probably 17. Those are probably the 2 bands I work the most, but I'll go wherever I can find a contact. To me, the essence of ham radio is community and connection. And so, although I have done digital modes and such, things that I'm really interested in, well, who are you? And what do you do? And where are you? And what is, I do a lot of contesting, but I try to get on the air when I can and actually have a conversation, whether it's for a minute or 2 minutes or whatever. But I think that to me is a part of the hobby that is important to me. It's about connection.
The social aspect of the on the air.
Yeah.
So you're a rag chewer then?
When I can, not often, but when I can. Most people, it's not like I think there's certainly rag chewing. I was going to say something that probably was not a good thing to say, but I'm not a long rag chewer. I can kind of sense when people really don't want to have a long conversation. So at some point I'll let that go. But it's nice. I mean, I really want, it's interesting to find out, I'm talking to somebody, he's raises currents in Northern California. Well, what's that like? What do you do? Or, I'm in, I do a lot of camping with my radio when I'm long road trips. So I remember being in, outside of Preston, Arizona camping, and I set up the antenna. I'm talking to a guy in the northern end of British Columbia who's building a homestead, and I'm having a conversation with him. What are you doing up there? And what are you doing? How's it like? What are you up to? And he's telling, we're talking. That to me is the crux, the core of amateur radio. And that doesn't mean I don't like the idea of what am I trying to really accomplish, is how far can my 100-watt light bulb shine? I mean, essentially, that's also what I'm interested in. Can someone see me in Tasmania Island? Yeah, I'd love that. That's cool. That's great. That's fun. And also fun to have a conversation if I can.
When you first got your license, did you go immediately to single sideband HF, or did you kind of go through the 2-meter handheld stage as well?
Those are pretty much at the same time.
And was that encouraged by the club where you actually tested?
Well, no, because Tacoma was about 45 minutes away, so it wasn't a club that I was belonging to. I tested. I was easy to find a place to test out. They're an interesting club in themselves. They're a very old club, probably, and they have a really that's an interesting club itself. But actually, where I've always, since 17 years old, I've been involved in the American Red Cross in some way, and was a instructor, a CPR and American first aid instructor for many, many years under the Red Cross, as well as I said, an EMT instructor outside the Red Cross for different states. And then when I came to Seattle, I started looking at going back to the Red Cross where I actually grew up in, so to speak. And what do you got going? And it turned out that they had just reforming after a long hiatus, a radio amateur communications team in the Red Cross at Seattle. And I said, I'm there. And they were actually my first, they're not a club, but that was my first club. And I was, the two people who organized it, who are no longer part of it, but they reset it up and did a great job, was, as I mentioned, Lynn Burlingame, where I met Lynn, N7 CFO, and Roland Brash, K7RWB, were the ones who organized it. And they were my experienced people that I kind of could see what they were doing. I was never had a problem with radios because being in EMS and and I went through the CB craze just like everybody, so I was pretty comfortable with radios. And especially use of radios in emergency situations, I was very comfortable with that, and firefighting. And but they were experienced hams, and I got to see what that was like and help them out a little bit as a kind of a helper. And so from there, when that team began to fall apart for reasons that are not by those two, but because of different changes in the way the Red Cross wanted to do things, et cetera, I was looking for another group to belong to, and that's where I kind of went to Mike and Key and joined them in Renton. I'm served as a newsletter editor for them for a little bit, and now I'm the activities manager for them right now.
Mike and Key, though, sounds like it's not an ARES group. It's not an emergency group.
It's not an ARES group. No, it's a Mike and Key is a amateur radio club. It's not an ARES group. There are people who belong to ARES who belong to the club, but it's not an ARES group. It actually is known for being the one that runs the largest swap meet in the area. So that's what they do. Yeah, they have probably the largest swap meet that they've been doing for, 40 years in this area.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. When the Red Cross Amateur Radio Group kind of fell apart, did you have a need, or did you feel the need to actually find another emergency amateur radio group in the Seattle area that you could take those skills and transfer them?
No, I actually didn't, because I remain part of the Red Cross. I have another category that I work with them on, which I am under mass care. So if they needed me to go out to, I work for a real job, so it's really hard for me to just cut away and go off to an earthquake or hurricane somewhere. But occasionally I will do like a local fire shelter here for the night. But eventually when I retire, I'll probably do more deployments. I'll have the time to do that. But I'm still part of Red Cross. I still am associated as a mass care person. And occasionally, if, technically I'm still disaster services technology, which was part of the radio group, was also setting up all the computer infrastructure for a shelter. And that included satellite communications for internet access as well. And maintaining that included running Ethernet and everything around the building. Now everything is wireless, so it's a lot easier. Maintaining one of the other things is that they set up what are called radio bucket radios, because each shelter needed a radio. So we have a 5-gallon bucket and an antenna, and it contained the Red Cross radio, coax, power supply, and instructions, because it was built for lay people to operate the Red Cross radio. And so it has instructions on how to set it up and how to operate it. The radio amateurs actually don't operate those radios. In fact, our radio team was primarily using the American Red Cross radio system as our primary radios, not amateur radio. Today, a lot of Red Crosses don't have their own radio teams. They use ARIES or other groups like that. But our group had a radio team, and we have our radio room, and which is open to any of the radio team members to use as well. We want people, we used to want to encourage them to use it because they don't want any surprises when you have to use it. And then we also learned about, we set up, because we don't assume the building will be intact when we need it. We have geographically stored radio rooms in a box and a radio trailer that sits somewhere. So if we need radio communications and we've lost the building, we can reestablish it.
Are these common practices of the Red Cross across America? Does a majority of Red Cross chapters across America have the bucket radio kit?
I don't know, because I've only been involved in the radio side in the Seattle area, but my assumption, they do have some level of always of radio communications. it's hard to tell. This is one of the things that's kind of confusing is in the last couple of years, just prior to COVID, I think, and during COVID, I think the Red Cross gave out mixed messages about we're getting rid of all radios and just going with cell phones. And a number of us lodged some. We don't think that's a good thing to do. And so some of the newer buildings that they're leasing, they don't put radios in this area. I don't know if that's national. So, but the depot is in, I think, Texas, where if you have to set up a shelter with computers and a satellite link, basically it comes over the hill within a day or two, and you can, and you can set everything up. But I really don't know about the other locations. I assume, we're in the Seattle area, so it's not like we have to worry about hurricanes. We have to worry about, mountains exploding every 600 years and earthquakes every 300-400 years that could devastate the city. So that's kind of where we sit.
Yeah, we think about that here too. I think we have our 100-year earthquake that's due. We have buildings that are, if not hundreds of years old, a few that are, maybe they have some foundations that are thousands of years old. So we should worry about earthquakes in a place like this as well. I myself am always surprised that an organization like the Red Cross might think that cell phone services are the way to go when every major disaster in America means that the cell phone service network is gone. For Hurricane Sandy, Katrina, over here, by the way, I'm actually thinking of deploying an outdoor Wi-Fi network just in case cell phone service disappears and the neighbors want to talk to each other.
Well, coming from a family of lawyers, I have to say this. I'm not an expert in the American Red Cross. I only have to do the experience of where they're doing things in the Seattle area. So there's my disclaimer. But I would say that, one thing that people don't, at least in this area, Red Cross is not a first responding agency. So they're called basically with 24 hours or so after a disaster occurs oftentimes. So I think the assumption is the Pico towers will get driven in or flown in or whatever, and the cell phone stuff will be reestablished. I'm not a firm believer in that, but it is their choice, and it could change today, tomorrow, and go back the other way around. I've been around the Red Cross, know that they can go back and forth very often. The Red Cross is probably one of the best organized organizations I've ever experienced in my life when it comes to disaster response. It's like that's when they're in their groove. It looks like it can look like kind of, why are you doing what's going on inside? It's like any kind of organization, large, you can get kind of like, why are you doing that? But the minute they go into disaster response mode, it's like a well-oiled machine. Everything goes off really, really well.
Those are great comments about the Red Cross. I wanted to kind of push on a little bit.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you're a member of the Northwestern Division Speakers Bureau. You could have speakers on any subject. Is that correct, or is it amateur radio related?
It's amateur radio related, generally speaking. All the people in the Speakers Bureau are amateur radio operators, and their topics are 99% about amateur radio. Mine is a little bit different in the sense that I have two topics that probably are not amateur specific. One is marketing for your amateur radio club is on my speakers list, and I have been asked to do that lecture once. And the other is that I've done a couple of different groups have asked me to do is emergency preparedness, not from the point of view of radio, but of the point of view of personal and home and family emergency preparedness.
Oh, in terms of like water that you should have and food that you should have stored away and flashlights and...
Where do you store stuff? How much stuff do you store? Even down to, have you thought about what you're going to do for a bathroom?
I can relate to this right now because of what's happening here. These are things that, frankly, probably nobody ever thinks about until it's too late. I mean, I never thought that tuna would disappear off the supermarket shelves.
Yeah, well, we ran an exercise twice, I think, at the Red Cross when we were doing the radio team, and the exercise was we simulated that we said to people, during this week, you're going to get an email that tells you the big earthquake happened. And it's going to give you all the damage assessment so you know where you are relative to where the damage is. And then we want you to begin self-organizing. We took all the people who were the heads of the Red Cross radio team. We said, you have to be quiet. And we wanted them to be able to bring the emergency net up exchange information, close the net down, and wait till the 8 o'clock, formal announcement net will come on. And so we had listed that we wrote up everything, and I sent it out, and we got the exercise going. And one of the things I had, was interesting because it was actually in the note. It says, take care of yourself, take care of your family, do this. And then finally said, get on the air. It's like number 8. Let's get on the air. And so when we turned on the radio, I was waiting for someone to do this. And I was turned on the radio and I'm waiting. And someone got on to call the net. And within 2 minutes after they got the email. And I wrote them a side email while they were on the air because, nobody answered them. And they were supposed to do it. Nobody answers, just go off the air and come back on the air the 30 minutes, every half hour, you go back up and listen if you're needed. And I wrote him an email and said, I really appreciate you getting on the air as quickly as possible after the net, but you went on too quickly because you could not have checked yourself, checked your family, checked your community, your road, did these things, secured the power, secured this in 2 minutes. So that was not the point of this exercise, to get on the air as quickly as possible. It was to make sure you're okay, those around you are okay, and things are secure, so then you could go on the air if necessary. And so that's really important, that when we do these kind of tests, that people do it realistically, that it's not about how do I get the net up as fast as possible. It's about, am I safe? And part of the things they had to report on is, could they report to the Red Cross in this many minutes? Or, did they need assistance? Did they need help assistance because of, they're blocked? Did they need assistance because there's a health problem because of damage, et cetera? And what were your readiness level? The fact that, so when we play these simulations, it's really important that we really play the simulation. It's not about, let's get the radios up and running as fast as possible. It's like, did you really consciously make those steps before you got the radio on to secure the environment before you decided to do this extra thing?
I think that you're obviously ringing some alarm bells in my head. If you're listening to this in 2 years, this is November of 2023, Israel's in the middle of a war. We have missiles that fly overhead and we run for shelters. Our shelters a few times a week, at least where I am, and other places they're running for shelters every hour or more. But I don't think anybody, at least in my neighborhood, has ever thought about securing the environment. So if we get hit or something like that, to make sure that, is the gas off? Is the electricity off? Is the water? Do we even know where those mains are in order to be able to secure our homes first? Escape routes. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we never thought of. Now we're thinking of those things, but now we're right in the middle of the war. I guess it's a blog post I should put up. Who thinks about those things? Because you never think that those things are going to happen. I don't think that anybody thought that Hurricane Katrina would wipe out New Orleans, because I guess New Orleans is lower than the sea level. So it has a seawall, right, that was compromised by the hurricane. And I think Hurricane Sandy, I remember when that went through the East Coast, nobody thought that their power would be gone for 2-3 weeks. When the power was gone, all of a sudden, well, the gas stations don't have power and they can't pump gas. And there's no gas in the cell sites, and so the cell towers go down. It's kind of like this stack of dominoes. You don't really think about all those dominoes before the disaster, but boy, am I thinking about those things now, and you're reminding me. I can tell you I'm changing a lot of tires. There are things that people don't think about doing until maybe it's too late, or they're learning by doing the hard way.
Yep, well, that's true. And the people don't really, we used to say 3 or 5 days, but now FEMA's saying 14 days of supplies. Well, when you think about the logistics of that, you have a family of 4 or 5, 14 days worth of supplies. That's a whole building. Or, some of the things I ask people is where your emergency.
It's a lot of water.
Yeah, it's a lot of water. I said, and I'm lucky because I can pump water out of the Lake Washington, a mile away from me. One of the things that I ask people is, they say, oh, I have supplies. I have some emergency supplies. Great. Where are they? Well, they're over here in the house. Well, what if the house collapses? How are you going to get those supplies? Have you thought about putting a little storage place outside your house for some of the supplies, except for water, which would freeze? Or, by the way, I have emergency supplies, and pretty much a lot of people I know have emergency supplies in each of their cars. Why? Could be stuck at office.
A change of clothes.
Yeah. So it's just to think, and again, it's we as ham radio operators, especially those in income, it's not just operating radios. It's also about thinking about what our response is in our immediate family and in our street and how do we help others in preparing for that as well, because we have that awareness. So anyway, that was my 2 cents on.
Look, I think it's very interesting. One of the hams here in Jerusalem was telling me that there's neighborhood emergency supplies. So if there's a earthquake problem or some kind of disaster problem in Jerusalem, then the neighborhoods have captains, the captains have supplies. These supplies include, say, emergency radios, portable radios. The only problem is there isn't anybody that knows how to put those radios together, how to take them out of the box, how to put them in the chargers, how to put the antennas on them. We take it for granted as hams in Israel. Maybe this is our value as hams, is that we actually know what to do with the emergency radios. But the majority of people don't have these skills, or we think they do as, it's pretty obvious how to do it. But it isn't so obvious to most people. And so this is why this training seems to be so important.
And that's also why when we built as I mentioned, those bucket kits for the American Red Cross shelters, is they had a very easy to read card inside each bucket. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. This is what traffic sounds like. This is how you identify yourself. And it was there. And then you have to step away and let people who don't know anything about radio actually do this.
It's like the instructions for making a peanut butter sandwich, right?
Yes, exactly.
The famous English essay.
Right. So, but it's and I'm sure in the U.S. would be like a CERT, Community Emergency Response Team, would be type of thing. But yeah, I think because of my background, you heard me say I've been in EMS, I've been in firefighting, I've been with the Red Cross. I have this sort of I've always been kind of had this in the back of the head that a disaster response is something that we have to. That's part of my DNA. It also permeates my work sometimes. I tend to look at the disaster, what's going to happen first. Oh, this project, well, what are the worst things that can happen? So I tend to go right to the disaster part of the work and say, okay, work backwards, and how do I prevent that disaster from happening?
I think that's a great idea. Now, you said the other topic that you speak on is marketing for your amateur radio club or marketing for amateur radio.
Yeah.
I think everyone does that badly. What do you think?
I don't know if it's, I don't want to say everybody, I don't have enough experience to say everyone does it badly.
I open the show every once in a while with ham radio. Do people still do that? I can't tell you how often I go out into the public and people say, what do you do? I say, well, I do a podcast on amateur radio. And they go, what's amateur radio? Most people say, what's amateur radio? In Israel, we call it chovevi radio. It's friends radio. What's interesting about that is it means that we're not talking to the general public. They don't know about us anymore. It used to be everybody knew a ham radio operator, or they knew that guy down the street was a ham radio operator. Nobody knows about ham radio, even in America. The hams know each other, but the general public doesn't even know that ham radio still exists unless there's a disaster and the local news channel is covering it. What do you think that we could do as amateurs that would perhaps extend, in a marketing way, extend the news about amateur radio to the general public?
That's a good question. I'm going to start it out at a little bit different level than that, if that's all right. Why I talk to clubs is because they want to increase their membership. So the first thing one of the things I like to tell people is all of you in this room have more than one hobby, most likely. It's more than ham radio, or more than one affiliation besides ham radio. And no one knows better if you're a member of the quilting club, and no one knows better how to present ham radio to the quilting club than you. No one knows how better to present ham radio to your synagogue or church than you. And so you are actually the marketer. You are the salesperson, and you know the right things to say that make it relevant to them. Because just to say ham radio exists is not relevant. Can't fit it in anywhere. It's like saying, hey, I like to do, Civil War miniatures. It's not relevant to me. So it's like, okay, that's interesting. And now moving on, it's not memorable. But if I can tie it into, hey, by the way, have we thought about, let's just take, go back to emergency response. And we're talking about let's say a church or synagogue. Hey guys, have we thought about putting a GMRS repeater on the top of this building and teaching everyone how to use GMRS so that when there is an issue, we can all contact each other and make sure we're all healthy and safe. Because we want to make sure we're a community. The church or synagogue is a community, or mosque is a community. So how do we make sure we are safe? And when we don't have cell phone access, and you're an amateur radio club that has repeaters, why don't you put a GMRS repeater on your tower too? Because a lot of your family members don't have amateur radio licenses, and if you get them using radios, they might be interested in doing more. Just use that, or the typical you'd see, like we have a class coming up. One of the other instructors I know is teaching a class to the Jeep group that does 4-wheel driving around here. They're teaching the technicians to be technicians because they want better radio communication. Okay, well, they already believe it's relevant. Now, how do you extend that? How do you make it so it's not just on the weekends when they're playing with the Jeep, but they get involved with the nets, so they get with a club, or they get involved with HF to start, hey, are you camping out? Wouldn't it be fun to do HF when you're camping out? We don't appeal to, we're never going to appeal to everybody. But we have to remember that the first level of sales is one-to-one with us individually and the different things that we affiliate with. The next is how to get ourselves out of when all else fails. So if all we're portraying this hobby as to the public as when all else fails, and you're not really thinking about this, all else fails happens very often, you're not going to get that involved.
In other words, amateur radio is more than a fire extinguisher.
Exactly. It's more than a fire. It's more than, hey, I need 12 guys to run the EOC out of, once every 5 years, or once, in our case, once every 100 years or whatever. But it's how do you make it relevant? Like, hey, are you an RC airplane modeler? There's a radio in that. What did you think about being able to do something even more interesting, with that, with the radio that you're using? That we'd have radio control telemetry channels that also. Have you ever thought about what it's like? Oh, you're interested in space. Have you thought about talking to the space station? We have to meet people where they are. And so the articles or placements we would do, let's say in whatever somebody's reading. And I would say that nobody's reading newspapers anymore. We know this, right? They're shutting down the newspapers.
I am.
Okay, you are. On behalf of the newspaper industry, thank you. But
you are right. Nobody's reading paper newspapers anymore, right?
So as a marketer, I'm not thinking of newspapers. I'm thinking about where are these people getting their information from online, and how do I position myself in that same space? So how do I tie the radio into another interest, which is like that 4-wheel drive? So if there's a 4-wheel drive YouTube channels, or there are 4-wheel drive blogs, how do I tie into those people and introduce the hobby? There's model rocketry guys who are doing telemetry. How do I tie into those guys? How do I introduce people who do model rocketry to amateur radio balloons, which gives them onto the radio?
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Do you see, David, that there could be an amateur radio club of people that are just marketing to these various groups? It seems to me that everybody in your club, as you said earlier, could be a marketer towards a special interest group.
Yeah.
That seems like they need training to be able to either write articles or create collateral material. Maybe that's a website that's uniquely positioned towards quilters and radio, for example. Do you see it being taken to that extent, to that level?
It all depends on what the club's motivation is, because in a lot of clubs, 5% of the people do 90% of the work. So it really depends on the club's motivation and how much they can get themselves together to do it. But also being visible, as you mentioned, sometimes it's just being visible. Going to when there are like the farmers market. There's lots of farmers markets. Maybe you look into doing a booth at a farmers market and having something on the air and exposing people that way. Maybe there is an arts and crafts shows that you take on with that, or there are, just setting up a radio station at the at one of the parks and putting up, welcoming people. It's just all about exposure and doing your hobby and being open to people asking questions. I have, I've talked about I camp a lot with my radio. So here's this, sometimes there's a 30-foot mast in my campsite with an antenna on it. And, you get the person walking by and they'll sometimes say, "You're talking to aliens?" I said, "No, but would you like to hear what I'm listening to or what I'm doing?" And some will sit down and they'll be interested. And I don't know if that's going to spark them interest in the hobby, but we are ambassadors at the one-to-one marketing, one-to-one sales. We are ambassadors. And if we are closed off to talking to people in face-to-face, then okay, that's the image of the hobby. Sometimes I think I'm not an introvert, but I think that we may have a tendency to be a hobby of introverts.
I think at times in my travels, I've been to amateur radio club meetings where I can walk in the door. Nobody acknowledges that I'm there as a new person. So like there's not someone greeting people at the door and saying, "Welcome to our amateur radio club. Who are you?" That kind of makes the group seem like, it's an old boys club and they're not welcoming new members. At least in my travels to America, I try to visit clubs as often as I can, and it's happened on every trip. I'll visit a club and I'm not the only new guy there. There might be 3 or 4 other people. We're all sitting in the back row. Nobody comes up to us and says, "Who are you?" and "Welcome to our club." And I've had people say, well, as a new licensee, I went and nobody cared that I was there. And so either they didn't become active or they went to another club.
Yep, I understand. I've heard that.
That's a marketing problem, right?
Yep, that's a marketing problem. I heard that before. That's a community problem. In other words, it's not a marketing problem. It's camaraderie. If we're there for camaraderie, we have to be open, right? We have to be heart to heart. We have to be open. We have to remember that we were once the guy who stepped into that room and nobody was talking to us on day one. How do we want to be to that person? How did we want them to be to us? And how to reflect that in the club itself. The club is the net vector of all the personalities that are there. And if it's a club that's, giving the impression that you have to break into this clique, then you're not going to survive very well. You're not going to thrive very well. Eventually you'll all die off and there won't be a club. But if you remember, what is it like to be new in this hobby or new into the club? And how do I want to be how would I have wanted to be treated? Or how was I treated that I liked? And I want to emulate that. So this is little things, right? But little things that can, you can turn off somebody for life that way if you don't open them up to that. And the same token is we have to ask the question, if we have lots of members in a club and 5% of the people are involved in doing anything, and the rest just not even, at any given time, only 10% are in a meeting, you have to ask the question, why did you join? What are we missing? See, as a marketer, remember, we're building a product, and the product has to be relevant to the person that we in the segment. So if you have 95% of the people who are doing nothing in the club, maybe not even showing up most of the time to a meeting, you have to ask your question, what are we missing? What are we not doing? What are they not doing? What do they want from joining the club? Because if they're not participating, why did they join the club to begin with? And oftentimes, people will do surveys for clubs. Now, a lot of people do surveys. We're going to survey our club and ask these questions. You're only going to get anywhere between 0.5% and 3% of response rate. That's all you're going to get. So how do you get around that? You divide up the number of people by the officers and you start making phone calls.
Right, and asking and doing your survey on the phone.
Doing the survey on the phone, but also making personal contact. Hey, haven't seen you at a meeting. Why don't you come to a meeting? We'll have a coffee together, tea together, and before the meeting. Or, hey, we're having a group breakfast before the meeting. Come join us. This is about building community, and you have to reach out. Some people are more able to find their niche on their own, and some people need to have someone who's welcoming. And we have to make it relevant to them, and we have to know what it means to be relevant to them.
Does your club have a repeater? Is there like a regular net there so that the members can actually talk to each other during the week?
Yeah, there is a lot of nets. We have we have a couple of different repeaters. There is a social net every night at 7:30 p.m. There's on a Wednesday night. There is the 7:30 becomes the tech net, the Elmer net. I host the first Wednesday of every month, and there are other hosts for each of the Wednesdays. There is a 220 net that meets on Sunday nights. There are simplex nets that are on. So there's and then there's the PSRG group has the one has another repeater, and they have nets at like 9:00 a.m., noon, and 9 p.m. I think we had some additional nets that came online for COVID, and it stayed there. There's a lot of nets in this area, so there's always opportunities. There's nets for kids too, for the Lake Washington Ham Club. But again, I had this happen just recently on the Wednesday night net that I was hosting. We were answering the questions too quickly. We were talking too quickly. So somebody checked when I did one extra check-ins. Every so often you ask for any other check-ins, during the conference, during the time. And the person came back and said, "Hey, I'm new ham. You're not giving me time to break into the conversation. I need you to slow down and give more space because I don't know how to break into the conversation." And we said, thank you. You're right. We weren't doing that. So we have to be, open that, hey, maybe I'm not giving enough time for somebody who's not used to using the radio to break in, rather and during the middle of a, really giving it some, instead, because, we have to remember that if we have 30 people on a net, there might be 3 people who are dominating or 5 people dominating the voice on net. That's like having a conversation in a room where you have 30 people in a meeting and only 5 people are giving space to talk. We have to make sure we give everybody space to talk.
It sounds amazing that you have this kind of activity so that your repeaters, they justify their existence, that they're there. The club has built this infrastructure and people are actually using it. I think that's pretty cool because you can go into other communities and you can kerchunk a lot of repeaters, but there's just nobody talking on any of them. They're all on WhatsApp or they're all on Signal or Telegram or something like that, but they're not on the radio.
Well, we do have Zoom meetings. During COVID, they started a Zoom Morse code session, a Zoom digital session, and a Zoom Elmer. So there were also Zoom. And when we finished the Wednesday night net on the TechNet, which runs till about 8:30, they're all invited to go to Zoom to continue if they want on that. So bridging the radio and the internet world, I think there's no reason why not to bridge the radio and internet world together if you need to. And also to be open that, and I don't do DMR, so I have no exposure to that. But, there's nothing wrong with us having a net for an hour, the photography net, the quilting net, the chess net, whatever. We have to be open that if there are amateur radios who have other hobbies that we want to use the net space time for, go for it. We don't have to everything be around the radio. The radio is just a vehicle for communication. It is not the thing always.
Right, but I feel as a guy that builds repeaters and infrastructure that it's frustrating to build out a network that nobody uses.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my marketing problem. I'm famous for creating product before I establish a need. That's the problem with a technical person being an entrepreneur. I have a history of creating businesses that nobody wants. But you know what? It was fun for me at the time. It's a marketing problem.
Here's the challenge. When you own a repeater, it's like owning a radio station. And the piece that you're missing is in the radio station, there's a program director who's constantly finding programming to put on. So if we own repeaters, we need to find times where we can solicit the people who are hams to come on and use that repeater for some sort of programming. And that might boost it up.
That's actually a great idea. I thank you for that because now you've got the other neurons in the back of my head churning. Let me ask you, what's the current rig?
Current rig.
What do you take when you travel?
It depends. You ask a marketer a question, it's always going to be answered with it depends. So if I'm going casually, like I'm going to go to a park today or I'm going to go for just a one-day drive and I want to sit up somewhere, then these days I take the Zygo G90. and I have my car set up to support, either an antenna on. I put a telescoping antenna on top of the car, or I have I use a vertical on the ground with coax, and that's pretty easy, quick, and dirty for me to do. But if I'm doing any extended camping trips, I take my FT991A and its external tuner, and I take a number of different antennas with me depending on what geography and weather it's at. So for longer trips, I take the 991A. For short day trips, I take the G90. In fact, the G90 is pretty much always there, ready for me to use. Then I have in the car. And then I have an FT8800 for mobile, for VHF, UHF. And then I have a VX7R Yaesu dual band for VHF, UHF, HT. And then I have a Bofeng tri-bander for HT, has a 220 in it. I think that covers pretty much the bulk of it. And yeah, there are times I carry everything with me.
Now, are you operating parks on the air, or are you just operating?
I'm a lousy at bookkeeping, and so I unofficially operate POTA. So, because I'm terrible at keeping track of filing things and doing things. So I unofficially run POTA or a parking lot on the air.
When you are operating in public, do you have collateral material for non-hams, or do you have a QR code or a website or something like that you'll direct non-hams to that happen to see you and actually will sit with you and listen to what you're listening to?
I don't, other than, I might direct them to the ARL website, but if someone's really, if I'm having a conversation with them and they say, like, I'm really interested in this, I actually give them my ARL email. And I say, email me, tell me that we talked, and I will be happy to get you any resources you need or tell you when the next class is in the area.
We've covered marketing in amateur radio, and I think some of the suggestions you've made are absolutely dynamite. I'll implement them myself. But is there anything we could do better to attract new people to the hobby?
Well, it comes back to one of the things I said is that we all are attached to other communities. And we know those communities, so we know how to approach those communities and talk about ham radio on a one-to-one basis. So getting people into the hobby, it starts with each of us individually, right? And we are the ambassadors, and we are the connection points to get into the hobby.
I think the new idea for me, anyway, is actually taking the hobby to our other communities to discuss it. I think before we opened, I said, I don't understand why somebody, the ARRL, somebody isn't writing a monthly column in the ARP magazine, for example, because ham radio is an ideal hobby for older people, for widows and widowers who want a social connection that's safe and interesting, perhaps. It seems to me that we're missing on that front in terms of being able to let the general population know that we still exist. So my question is really, is there something we could do better to attract new people?
I think there is, and I think one is I'm going to separate the word new people into two different categories: young people under the age of 25 and older people over the age of 40. Now I notice I put a gap in there, and I put a gap in there because, and in fact, you'll relate to this because almost every one of your interviews does this that I've heard, and that is, well, I had my license when I was 16, and then I went to college, started a family, and then I stopped doing ham radio and then my career, and then by 40, I was ready to come back again. And if you actually, once upon a time, I did pull all the demographics I could on amateur radio in the U.S., and I found it was exactly a bimodal distribution between that the younger group and the older group. And so so from the point of view of how do we approach, and you said the ARRP magazine, that's a great idea. People who are 40 and over, they have time, they have resources, they're looking for community. They spent a lot of time with their lives centered around business and centered around their families and the associations that brings, like the PTA and soccer mom type of thing. Now they want their time back. So how do we, the question is, how do we reach out to those people? And I think there are natural places for us to do that. And I keep coming back to church, mosque, and synagogue, because they all have men's groups or women's groups or, something that's, they serve the elderly, etc. those are places, senior community centers in your town, great places to do that, to reach out and bring that in. Hey, can we build a station in that senior community station? It's the center. And then begin teaching classes out of there and teaching those people. So, or, if you are in a business that is open to it, to actually have after hours club meeting or organizational meetings. So where you can bring people in. So start thinking wider in the net, not just I'm going to put an article in the newspaper because that's very passive. How do I do something more? It doesn't mean not to do that, by the way. It just means that's one channel and there are other channels to use. And so to attract more people, we have to always come back to, is it relevant? So, and you've heard, your guests have said this a number of times, it's no longer relevant to say you can talk to people around the world. It's not relevant. What's relevant is, do you like to build stuff? Are you a maker? There's every time I teach a class, I reach out to the maker community and say, please post this on the maker sites if anyone's interested. The maker community is a great community for us to work with. It's a fantastic community, and I don't think we do enough. I don't do enough. I shouldn't say we. I don't do enough outreach in the maker community, and I suspect others don't. So there's a good community that we can leverage who are already tinkering, who already want to do technology, and who don't always realize they're doing wireless is radio, and that's one thing. And then on the other side is the younger people, to understand that when you're reaching out to the young people, you're planting a seed that will come to fruition when they're 40 years old.
I think you're right.
The expectation shouldn't be, I'm going to make a ham that's at 16 years old or 20 or 18 years old, and they're going to go become hams for ever. No, you're building a ham for whatever reason who's interested in robotics, or who's interested in space communication, or who is whatever the situation is, if it's Explorer Postal and Boy Scouts, is there a police Explorer Scout group, then they're great for radio too, So you look for all these tensions, but you realize I'm planting a seed. This person may never be a ham radio. They may be a ham radio operator today, but I don't expect them to continue. But I want them to remember that when they're 40 and they have time, I go, oh yeah, I can come back to that.
You actually make me feel better from the standpoint that we think to be successful, we have to have a bunch of kids. Like we were. Like I was, like the majority of the people that I've interviewed over the last 9 years. We all came into it when we were 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. And to be successful, that's what we have to have. But the world's different now. We live 20 years longer than the average when we were kids. Therefore, it seems to me that we are successful if we have a bunch of 35, 40-year-olds that are coming in. Those are the new kids.
Yeah.
They could be on potentially for 50 years.
Yeah, and how do we not only do we get them in, we make it relevant to them, but we keep, this is what's wonderful about this hobby, is the license is just the gateway to lifelong learning.
That's right.
I've been doing this since 2008, but I was involved in electronics before then. It's still something new out there. There's always something. This is the widest hobby. It's just incredibly how wide this hobby is. I mean, you could start out going, I'm a VHF guy doing handheld stuff, go into HF, and then say, you know what? I've always wanted to do gigahertz stuff. Really high. It's like, well, talk about a small group of people, but you can go anywhere. I want to talk to a geosynchronous satellite. If you have one overhead, like you do, great.
Or I want to do 3D printing for my Arduino projects because I can't find a box that works for what I want to build, right? So to solve the problem, you extend your skill set into other areas. It might be woodworking, machining, or whatever, in order to complement the amateur radio side of your project.
And it's okay to stop and just do one thing. See, you're not under pressure to be able to do everything, right? There are people who don't want to do Arduino, let's say. That's fine. There are people who don't want to do space. There's people like me who don't do DMR. It's fine. If you just want to do on your HT, talking every so often to people, great. You want to have a bunch of towers and antenna farm behind your house, great. Nobody is going. There'll be people who are envious of what you're doing, but I think, but no one's going to say you should continue on with more things in the hobby. No, you find your space, And if it's fun, you stay there. And if you want to go to a different space, go to a different space. That's okay. There's communities everywhere for all of this stuff.
I think that's a great place for us to stop. I'm so grateful, David. You responded to the call that I sent out to the listeners that I needed more new content. I needed people to reply and be my guests. This was so much fun. And I realized at the beginning of the conversation you thought we might not have enough to talk about, but it looks like we did. I'm so grateful that you took the time to speak to me on QSO Today. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73, and I hope that I get to meet you the next time I'm in the Seattle area.
Please do. I'd love to have a cup of coffee with you. And I thank you for having me on the show, and I really appreciate all the work you've been doing in this community worldwide. And I wish you and yours only peace and good things in the near future and the far future.
Thank you so much. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with David. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W7DAO in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.